In this video, Jordan Peterson explains the difference between humanist, existentialist, and phenomenologist.
We didn't talk about the humanists and the existentialists and the phenomenologists. It's a mouthful of words, so let's put a little bit of foundation under those. So if you're a humanist, to be a humanist means really to be a creature of the Enlightenment. And a humanist thought, in some sense, at least this is what the humanists think, they think of it as post-religious. And they think of humanistic thought as putting the value of the human being at the center of the cosmos in some sense, valuing the person as they are, and then also valuing the person that they could be. And promoting the pathways of development that would allow people to become what they could be as creatures that are valuable in their own right. So a humanist, for example, would be very skeptical of claims, so let's say standard Christian claims, and I use that example because the realm of ideas that these thinkers emerged out of was almost always Judeo-Christian, and so the roots of their thinking are in those systems, and you can't understand their thinking without understanding that. And so part of humanism was a rebellion against the idea that life on earth, so to speak, was of limited value because everything of any importance was going to happen in the afterlife after you die. So it's like, no, it's here and now. It's right now that matters. And life in the present is what's important. And you don't need some kind of afterlife or some kind of belief in a transcendent reality in order to find value right here and now. So, fine. There's a lot of good things about that idea. And the whole idea that you can improve yourself in some sense is a humanistic idea. And most of you, how many of you believe that you can improve yourself? So, is there anybody who doesn't believe that? That's willing to admit it? So, usually people only don't believe that if they're very depressed or hopeless. But it's not self-evident, in many cultures, you could think of medieval culture, for example, in Europe, where, you were sort of stuck in your position. There was no real idea of self-improvement. You could try not to sin, but you weren't going to get, radically better in some way. You were just who you were, and that was that. But that's not the case for the humanists. Now, existentialists, they're kind of a different kettle of fish. So, when Freud talks about psychopathology, because a lot of personality is about pathology, right? How personalities can go wrong. Freud kind of thinks of the normal person, roughly speaking, as healthy in their normality, but perhaps transformed into a pathological version of themselves by some sort of past trauma. And that might often be an abusive childhood, or maybe a sexually abusive childhood, because, Freud talked a lot about that, and it happens fairly frequently. So for Freud, all things considered, if you weren't healthy, there was a reason for it. Something terrible had happened to you, and you needed to come to terms with that terrible thing, however you might do that, and put yourself back together, and then you could wander along being a healthy person. But the existentialists, that's not how they think at all. They think the standard human being is pathological. And the reason they think that is because they think that self-conscious existence, so the life of a creature that knows it's bounded in time and space, right? Knows it's vulnerable to disease and illness and death and the loss of things that they love, and the disintegration of all things in some senses, that's enough of a problem to give you problems without having to have been abused by it. And so the existentialists view life itself as a problem of sufficient magnitude that it can destabilize you mentally merely by being aware of it. And so they also believe that often what people do as a consequence of that is flee from their own awareness. So how do you deal with the fact that life is suffering? Well, you don't think about it. Well, for an existentialist, that's not a very good answer. And I would also say, generally speaking, for clinical psychologists, that's also not a very good answer, because the literature suggests pretty damn strongly that the harder you run from something you're afraid of, the larger it becomes and the faster it chases you. So avoidance is generally a very bad strategy. Now, it's not always the case, because sometimes if you can't do anything about something, really, you can't, well, there's not a lot of sense spending a lot of time planning and struggling against it, and sometimes people are in genuinely hopeless situations, but often not. So I really like the existentialists, man. I think they're, well, all the people that we're going to talk about, their thinking is extraordinarily valuable. You know, it helps situate you in your own life. It helps clarify the nature of your relationship to other people in the world. It helps you lay out what your future could be if you were the creature that you could be. It's really wonderful. Phenomenologists, they're a tricky bunch. The fundamental phenomenologist was Martin Heidegger, who was also somewhat tangled up with the Nazis. Which was clearly not a good thing. And, people debate about whether or not you can separate out his philosophy from what tangled him up with the Nazis. And I think you can, So, anyways, Heidegger wanted to take a fresh look at the nature of reality. And so Heidegger's idea was that we made a fundamental philosophical error way back when we were Greek, ancient Greek, roughly speaking, and that we started concentrating on the wrong elements of, he doesn't really call it reality, he calls it being. So a phenomenologist is someone who's concerned with being. And you might think, well, what's the difference between being and reality? And the answer to that is, it depends on how you define being, and it depends on how you define reality. So Heidegger's observation was that for modern people, roughly speaking, reality is sort of a de-animated, material, objective substrata. It's dead in its essence, roughly speaking. And the things that are most real are precisely those things. You could think about that as objective reality for all intents and purposes. But what Heidegger tried to point out is that it's a choice in some sense. Because your knowledge is finite, because you're fundamentally ignorant about all things, you have to decide that certain things are true and then act from that point. And, Heidegger's point was, there's a lot of things that you can decide about at the very fundamental level of axiom. And so one of the things you can decide, for example, is whether or not the objective world is what's more real, or whether or not your lived experience is what's more real. Now you might think, well, what's the distinction there? And I would say, the distinction is probably something like watching someone in pain on a video and being in pain yourself. So pain's a good example of an element of being, because it's obviously you experience it within your own. It's hard to talk about this because he uses different terminology. Pain is an element of your being. And it's not something, the pain itself is not something that you can even conceptualize in objective terms. Like you can measure it, maybe your heart rate goes up when you're in pain or something like that, or your facial expressions change. So you can index it, but the indexes are not the phenomena. That's hence phenomenology, right? And so the phenomenologists have built up an entire system of thinking predicated on the initial axiom that the best way to approach life is to assume that being is the fundamental reality rather than the objective as the fundamental level.